Biden crime bill is before us, calls for the death penalty for 51 offenses. The first federal death penalty after declared constitutional was a bill written by me. I support the death penalty. I don't oppose the death penalty on moral grounds. We do everything but hang people for jaywalking in this bill.
Biden crime bill. Biden himself called it the Biden crime bill. You heard him. 51 penalties for death penalties. We do everything but hang people for jaywalking in this bill. Now, understand, the reason why Democrats were pushing this hard on this is because they didn't want to seem weak. During those days, Republicans used to always call Democrats weak on defense and weak in regards to criminal justice. And the way to deal with that is to push back on it by basically moving to the right on those issues, just to try to negate the attacks of them calling you weak. And when you move to the right on those things, they still turn around and call you weak. Well, Biden and his crime bill, like you said, they put people in prison for very, very long times, including with the disparity between crack and cocaine. Now, understand, crack was cheaper, and crack would get you a longer jail sentence. So when you had a situation where African Americans or people who were poor would be more likely to use crack, you had people who were richer who would use cocaine. The cocaine didn't send you to jail for a long period of time. The crack sent you to jail forever. Not to mention you had like mandatory minimums. If I'm not mistaken, it's three strikes and you're out, those type of laws. Biden crime bill. Biden crime bill. You wonder why there's such a skew in regards to the disproportionate number of African Americans in prison. Well, part of it has to do with the way cops over-police. The other part of it has to do with stuff like this, where people are in prison for longer sentences than their white counterparts. Not to mention, poverty incentivizes bad choices. But beyond that, Joe Biden is giving a speech, and he's saying something that's mind-blowing in the speech. And I gotta be honest, I don't know who's sending him out here. I don't know exactly when this speech came out. This says 21 hours ago. But he is saying something mind-blowing. As I listen to this, I'm like, wow, does he know what he's saying? Biden is basically arguing that the African American community was disposable and irredeemable, and uses the disposability and the irredeemability of those people who are on crack, for example, as a justification in some way to put them in prison for basically forever. That's a mind-blowing statement. You probably think I'm being hyperbolic. I am not, unfortunately. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This video is not going to be long. I just saw this video and it bugged me, so I wanted to do a video on it. Let's listen to Biden. Listen exactly what Biden says. Listen very carefully.
Drugs was one that Pat Moynihan, and he's a great guy. Remember, the crack epidemic came from the Bahamas, and we were told by medical doctors at the time that because it permeated the membrane of the brain more quickly, it was the crack you never come back. It was somehow fundamentally different than someone in a beautiful neighborhood like this sniffing a line of cocaine would get not automatic sentence for.
The crack epidemic came from the Bahamas. So there's charges that crack came from the CIA, meaning they were pumping that stuff into our communities. The person who initially put this story out was basically smeared and vilified, but that story started to get more traction a little bit later on, like maybe a decade later. So there's that. But it came from Colombia. I mean, if you're going to say where, the location of the crack, it was Colombia. Now, there's a history on it that makes the case that says immigrants that were coming in showed people how to make the conversion between crack and cocaine. I got to be honest, that doesn't entirely matter. I mean, what really matters here is that crack and cocaine, the difference is a binder, meaning whatever you use to cut the substance with, like baking soda or, for that matter, strychnine. But it's the cutting that makes it a different substance. So I just want to make that very clear. It's the same substance. One is just cut that becomes crack and it becomes somewhat of a different form. And the other one is cocaine. Cocaine sniffed. This is more expensive. This one goes more towards the rich. Crack, it can be basically broken up. It's cheaper. The high takes place apparently faster, maybe for somewhat of a shorter period of time. And it has more side effects. Those are your two substances. Again, the difference is basically the cutting agent.
It permeated the membrane of the brain more quickly. It was the crack, you never come back. It was somehow fundamentally different than someone in a beautiful neighborhood like this sniffing a line of cocaine.
All right. It was something fundamentally different than someone in a beautiful neighborhood like this sniffing a line of cocaine. Wealth. It's poverty, right? I mean, he's not saying poverty, but basically he's making a class argument. People who are in this particular neighborhood will have the money and the resources to buy cocaine. And they would sniff that cocaine, and that would be somewhat fundamentally different than people who did not have those resources, who were not in a nice neighborhood like this, and who were using crack. Let's keep going. I want to make it very clear.
Would get not automatic sentence for.
Right there. And what did he say? Would not get automatic sentence for it. Meaning the tie-in, Joe Biden is being weird in the way that he's talking about it. But basically the tie-in, somebody must have said or asked him a question regarding the disparities between crack and cocaine. And the argument that he's basically making here for his crime bill, because it was his crime bill, he named it himself. I just showed you the video where he named it. But basically, people who are in a nicer neighborhood and can afford the better drug get a lesser sentence. That's class. If these people who were using crack had the opportunity, let's say, to have higher incomes, I would imagine that they would also use cocaine as opposed to crack. They got their hands on crack because that's what they can afford. To make the case that you use crack, you never come back, and that it's fundamentally different, that sounds like you're making an argument for why the longer jail sentences were being put in place. Now, again, this is an issue of class. It's just an issue of poverty. Now, you can say that the sentence or the consequences for using crack is worse. That's true. But are they really this level of irredeemable and disposable where you can just say, well, because they're using crack, we're going to toss them away and they can just be in jail and rot for much longer, as opposed to the person who can afford the better drugs and we can just let these guys out? Is there any coincidence that these people just so happen to be white and these people typically aren't? And when I'm saying typically, I'm saying disproportionately because of the people who would use that drug, typically poor. To give a little example in regards to cost differences, costs. 10.25 for 1/10 of a gram, $40 for 1/4. And for cocaine, $120 to $150 for 1/8 of an ounce. For cocaine, yeah. Dramatically more expensive. Is that right? Think about what I'm asking you here. You have a substance. One substance gets broken down from the standpoint of having an agent added to it, like baking soda. And with that agent of baking soda being added to it, it creates another form of the drug. The drugs are basically the same thing. Joe Biden comes in and says, well, this group, despite the drug being the same thing, is going to get lesser time. And they're going to get lesser time because their social standing is of such and of worth that we don't think it's going to adversely affect them in the way that that drug is going to adversely affect them, despite the drug being fundamentally the same thing, and despite the key difference between these two people being issues of class. And you slap this person on the wrist. But this person, who's living in a difficult living situation, that guy gets the book thrown at him. And again, pointing out that this disparity of class also breaks down into a disparity of race, where you have one group being in prison for much longer sentences for basically the same drug. And Joe Biden wanted to cut social services that much further. That would have exacerbated this problem that much more. They knew that that disparity was in that crime bill. And Joe Biden here making that case of once you do crack, you never come back. And that's why the disparity was in the bill. That's why we were okay with putting these people in prison for dramatically longer prison sentences, because they weren't going to come back. They were basically irredeemable and disposable. Because if you're going to argue to me that, no, they were redeemable, then you can't make this argument to me that you can throw them in prison, for mandatory minimums, or for the most part, 3 strikes and you're out and you're just going to be in prison forever. You can't make both of those arguments. Those arguments contradict one another. The rich were redeemable, the poor weren't. according to Joe Biden. And that also just means the blacks aren't. My qualm with this is throwing people away stuff. That bugs me, especially when I know that the people that Joe Biden is specifically talking about here are people who are basically just poor. Like